I have watched guilty people cry. I have watched innocent people tremble. I have watched witnesses collapse under cross-examination after telling a single lie. But one case still follows me long after the courtroom emptied, not because of the verdict, because of a smile. A woman named Karen Whitmore walked into my courtroom wearing an expensive tailored suit, sat down with complete confidence, and throughout nearly the entire testimony, she smirked, not smiled politely. Smirked every witness she believed she had outsmarted, made that smirk a little wider. She thought she had fooled everyone. She thought the evidence favored her. She even looked directly at me with that same expression. And then I spoke one sentence. I will never forget what happened to that smile. It disappeared so quickly that even the bailiff glanced at her in disbelief. Believe me, years on the bench teach you that confidence built on deception has a remarkably short life. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back west to where this case truly began. The plaintiff was a man named Ethan Parker, 43 years old, owner of a family-operated home renovation business in Ohio. Yet professional, soft-spoken, the type of man who answered exactly what was asked, no more, no less. Across from him sat Karen Whitmore, 46 years old, impeccably dressed, diamond bracelet, luxury handbag, every document inside perfectly organized. At first glance, she looked like the most prepared litigant in the room. Interesting, very interesting. The lawsuit involved a kitchen renovation worth nearly $60,000. Karen claimed Ethan abandoned the project halfway through construction after taking a large deposit. According to her complaint, she was left with a demolished kitchen, unsafe electrical wiring, and thousands of dollars in additional repair costs. She demanded full reimbursement, punitive damages, court costs, everything. Interesting, very interesting, I asked Ethan to explain. He calmly placed a binder on the evidence table, invoices comprots, building permits, inspection reports, everything neatly labeled. Years on the bench teach you something important. People who truly understand their case rarely need dramatic speeches. Their documents usually speak at first. Karen interrupted before Ethan finished describing the contract. He always leaves out the important parts. Interesting, very interesting. I reminded her she would have an opportunity to testify. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and there it was, that smirk. Subtle, confident, almost amused. It immediately caught my attention. Years on the bench teach you to watch faces as carefully as documents, because people often reveal what they believe long before they say it aloud. Karen looked like someone who already knew how the story would end. That observation stayed with me a lot. Then Ethan handed me the signed renovation contract. Interesting, very interesting. Every page carried initials. Every change order was signed. Every payment schedule acknowledged. Nothing appeared unusual. I looked toward Karen. Did you sign these documents? Yes, without hesitation. Interesting, very interesting. So there's no dispute regarding the agreement itself? No. The dispute is what happened afterward. Again, that smirk very slight, but unmistakable. Then Ethan quietly explained that construction stopped only after Karen repeatedly refused scheduled progress payments required under the contract. Interesting, very interesting. According to him, materials had already been delivered, cabinets custom ordered, electrical inspections completed, but after the second payment became overdue, work legally paused. Karen immediately laughed, actually laughed. He wants people to believe I refused to pay. The spectators exchanged uncomfortable looks. Years on the bench teach you something else. People who laugh at testimony instead of addressing it often believe emotion will distract from evidence. Sometimes it works, sometimes. I asked Ethan whether he had documentation supporting missed payments. He simply nodded. Yes, Your Honor. No speeches, no accusations, just confidence. Interesting, very interesting. He handed over copies of invoices, certified delivery receipts, Dotmine reminders. Everything appeared consistent. The dates matched perfectly. Then I turned toward Karen. Did you receive these invoices? Yes. Interesting, very interesting, but they were incorrect. Interesting answer, very interesting. Which specific invoice was incorrect? Karen paused, just briefly, then answered, all of them. The courtroom became quiet, very quiet, because broad answers rarely survive detailed questions. Years on the bench teach you that every single day. Then Karen reached into her folder, pulled out a thick stack of photographs, and slid them confidently across the table. These end his case. Interesting. Very interesting. The photographs showed the partially demolished kitchen, exposed wiring, missing cabinets, unfinished flooring. Everything appeared chaotic. The spectators looked concerned. Karen noticed. And that smirk grew even wider. She believed the case had just turned in her favor. She had no idea one tiny detail hidden inside the very first photograph was about to erase that smile forever. The moment Karen Whitmore slid those photographs across the evidence table, I noticed something unusual. Not the unfinished kitchen, not the exposed wiring, not the missing cabinets. Those were exactly what I expected to see in a renovation dispute. It was something much smaller. Years on the bench teach you that the biggest lies often unravel because of the smallest details. The courtroom remained silent. Ethan Parker folded his hands calmly. Karen leaned back in her chair, and there it was again, that smirk, confident parchment, almost daring me to doubt her. Interesting, very interesting. I picked up the first photograph, then another, then another. Every image appeared to support Corin's story. At first, the demolished cabinets, construction dust. Tools scattered across the floor. Everything looked abandoned. Then I returned to the very first photograph. Something about it continued bothering me. Interesting, very, very interesting. I leaned closer. Then closer still. Years on the bench teach you never to ignore the feeling that something doesn't quite fit. Usually, there's a reason. The spectators watched quietly. Karen continued smiling. She clearly believed I was carefully studying proof that favored her. Instead, I was studying a small digital thermostat mounted on the kitchen wall. Interesting, very interesting. The thermostat display showed the date, not intentionally. It simply happened to be visible in the corner of the photograph. I enlarged the image. The courtroom became silent. The date read, October 18. Interesting, very interesting. I looked through the complaint. According to Karen, Ethan abandoned the renovation on October 2, 16 days earlier. That immediately caught my attention. Because according to the contract, demolition wasn't even scheduled to begin until after the second payment cleared. And according to Ethan's records, construction had already stopped by October 4. Interesting, very interesting. So why did a photograph allegedly proving abandonment carry a date more than 2 weeks later? I looked toward Karen M. Whitmore. When exactly were these photographs taken? Without hesitation, she answers, the day he abandoned the project. Interesting, very interesting. I gently turned the photograph toward her. Would you like to look at the thermostat? Her smile weakened, only slightly, but enough for me to notice. Year on the bench teach you that confidence often fades one small piece at a time. I pointed to the enlarged display. Would you read the date aloud? Silence, Doffel, silence. Karen stared at the photograph, then quietly answered, October 18th. Interesting. Very interesting. So help me understand. You testified these photographs were taken on October 2nd. Yes, but your own photograph says October 18th. Another pause, longer this time. Finally, the thermostat must have been wrong. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Possible. Certainly, electronic devices can display incorrect dates. But years on the bench teach you something important. One coincidence can happen. Several coincidences become much harder to believe. I reviewed the second photograph. Interesting. Very interesting. Another digital display, this time the microwave, the same date, October 18. Then the third photograph, a security keypad beside the garage entrance, Agon, October 18. The courtroom became perfectly still. 3 separate electronic devices, 3 identical dates. Interesting. Very interesting. I slow looked toward Karen. That seems like an extraordinary coincidence. She no longer smiled, not completely, but the smirk was beginning to disappear. Then Ethan quietly stood. Your Honor, may I explain? I nodded. He handed me another folder. Interesting, very interesting. Inside were text messages exchanged between Karen and the project manager. The timestamps immediately caught my attention. October 15, October 16, October 17. Interesting, very interesting. The messages discussed cabinet delivery, countertop measurements, final paint colors. The renovation was clearly still active well after Karen claimed it had been abandoned. I looked toward Karen. Were these messages fabricated? No. Interesting. Very interesting. So construction activity continued after October 2nd. Karen hesitated, then quietly answered. Some discussions. Interesting answer. Very interesting. Because only moments earlier she testified the project had already been abandoned. Now, construction discussions were continuing nearly 2 weeks later. That contradiction mattered enormously. The spectators exchanged curious looks. Then Ethan handed me one final document from the same folder, a delivery confirmation, interesting, very interesting custom kitchen cabinets, delivered October 17, signed for by Karen Whitmore. The room became silent, silence, because according to her own lawsuit, the contractor had disappeared weeks before those cabinets even arrived. Years on the bench teach you that timelines rarely lie. People do. I looked back toward Karen. The smirk was almost completely gone, but I had the distinct feeling she still believed she could recover. She hadn't realized the most damaging evidence wasn't in Ethan's documents. It was hidden inside her own photographs. And once I noticed it, there would be no explaining it away. The moment I returned to Karen Whitmore's photographs, I stopped looking at the dates. Not because they were no longer important, because something even more interesting had caught my attention. Years on the bench teach you that when one inconsistency appears, you should examine everything else much more carefully. The courtroom remained silent. Ethan Parker sat calmly. Karen no longer looked nearly as confident as she had 20 minutes earlier. The spectators leaned forward. Everyone sensed the hearing was beginning to shift. I enlarged the first photograph again. Then the second. Then the third. Interesting, very interesting. My attention wasn't on the damaged kitchen anymore. It was on the background. Specifically, a cardboard box sitting near the dining room entrance. Ordinary, plain, easy to overlook, except for a deranged large shipping label. Interesting, very interesting. I zoomed in. The label wasn't perfectly clear, but one line remained readable. Rush replacement cabinets. The courtroom became quiet, very quiet. I looked toward Ethan. Did you order replacement cabinets? Yes, Your Honor. Why? He answered immediately. Because Miss Whitmore rejected the first cabinet color after approving it. Interesting, very interesting. He handed me another document. The cabinet manufacturer's order history. Everything matched. The original cabinets had already been built. Karen changed her mind. New cabinets had to be manufactured. That delayed the project by almost 2 weeks. Interesting, very interesting. I looked toward Karen. Did you request different cabinets? She hesitated. Years on the bench teach you that hesitation often appears when documents begin replacing opinions. Finally, yes. Interesting, very interesting. So part of the construction delay resulted from your own design change. Another pause. Yes, the courtroom remained silent. That mattered a lot. Because Karen's complaint repeatedly blamed Ethan for every delay. Not once did it mention her own change requests. Then I noticed something else inside the photographs. Interesting, very interesting. A wall calendar, barely visible near the pantry. I enlarged it. The spectators leaned closer. Several dates had handwritten notes. October 14, cabinets arrive. October 17, countertops. October 19. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked toward Karen. Whose handwriting is this? She stared at the image, then quietly answered. Mine. Interesting. Very interesting. Years on the bench teach you that people often forget how much of their own story they accidentally preserve. Karen's calendar completely contradicted her testimony. According to her lawsuit, the renovation ended on October 2. According to her own calendar, she expected contractor checks nearly 3 weeks afterward. That distinction mattered enormously. Then Ethan quietly reached into another folder. Interesting. This might help explain the schedule. Inside were email exchanges with cabinet suppliers, electricians, countertop installers. Every subcontractor confirmed the same thing, continued. Work continued until Karen suspended access to the property after refusing another scheduled payment. Interesting, very interesting. Not abandonment, those are suspended access. Then I found something unexpected attached to the subcontractor emails. A home security log. Interesting, interesting, very interesting. Karen's house used a smart entry system. Every contractor entering the property received temporary digital access codes. I reviewed the entry log, October 15. Electrician entered at 8:02 a.m. Exited at 2:41 p.m., October 17. Cabinet installers entered. October 18, plumbers entered. Interesting, very interesting. The timestamps matched the photographs perfectly. The courtroom became completely silent because the digital entry records proved workers were still entering the home long after Karen claimed everyone had abandoned the project. I looked directly at Karen. Did you authorize these access codes? Yes. Interesting. Very interesting. So on October 18, when your photographs were taken, contractors were still actively working inside your home. Karen didn't answer immediately. Years on the bench teach you that eventually every fabricated timeline reaches a point where it simply cannot survive another document. Karen had reached that point. Finally, she whispered, yes. The spectators exchanged stunned looks because now the central allegation of her lawsuit was collapsing, not because Ethan had spoken louder, because Karen's own evidence refused to support her. Then Ethan quietly handed me one final envelope. Interesting, very interesting. He hadn't mentioned it all morning. Inside was a USB drive, symbol unmarked. I looked toward him. What is this? He answered calmly. My security camera footage from the job site. The courtroom became perfectly still. Karen's face immediately lost what remained of her confidence. Years on the bench teach you to watch reactions before evidence is even presented. Sometimes the reaction tells you exactly how important that evidence will be. And judging by Karen's expression, she already knew what was on that video. She just didn't know that I was about to watch it. The moment Ethan Parker handed me the USB drive, I noticed something I hadn't seen all morning. Karen Whitmore stopped looking at me. Years on the bench teach you that eye contact often disappears before confidence does. The courtroom remained silent. The spectators watched carefully. Ethan remained perfectly calm. Karen folded her hands tightly together. That small movement caught my attention immediately, because people rarely grip their own hands when they believe the next piece of evidence will help them. Interesting, very interesting. I inserted the USB drive. A security camera recording opened. The camera overlooked the kitchen renovation from the opposite corner of the room, wide-angle, clear picture. Continuous recording. Interesting, very interesting. The timestamp immediately matched the dates already established by the electronic entry logs, October 18, the very same day Karen's photographs were taken. I pressed play. Workers entered. Cabinets were being installed. Electricians checked wiring. Plumbers measured pipe locations. Everything appeared orderly, professional, exactly what I would expect from an active renovation. Interesting, very interesting. Then I skipped forward. Several hours passed. The crew finished for the day. They cleaned the work area, collected their tools, locked the temporary material storage cabinet, and left the property. The timestamp showed 5:14 p.m. Interesting, very interesting. The kitchen was unfinished, but it was clearly under active construction, not abandoned. That distinction mattered enormously. Then something happened. 5 minutes later, Karen entered the kitchen alone. The courtroom became completely silent. Years on the bench teach you that many cases are decided not by what people say, but by what they do when they believe nobody is watching. Karen slowly walked through the kitchen, examining everything. She wasn't upset. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even angry. She appeared thoughtful, interesting, very interesting. She picked up her cell phone, took several photographs, the very same photographs now sitting in evidence. Then she looked directly toward the unfinished cabinets, paused, and smiled. Not a happy smile, not a relieved smile. That familiar smirk, the exact same one she had worn throughout today's hearing. The spectators exchanged uneasy looks, because suddenly that expression carried a completely different meaning. Then Karen did something unexpected. She walked toward the temporary electrical panel, opened it, looked inside, then closed it again. Interesting, very interesting. Nothing unusual, at least not yet. She continued walking around the kitchen, then stopped beside a stack of unopened cabinet boxes. She looked around the empty room. Years on the bench teach you something important. When people suddenly check whether anyone is watching, pay very close attention to what they do next. Karen glanced toward every doorway, then toward every window. Then she reached into one of the unopened cabinet boxes. The courtroom remained perfectly still. I leaned slightly forward. Not because I knew what she was doing, because I didn't. Interesting, very interesting. She removed several cabinet shelves, placed them carefully on the floor, then reached deeper into the box. The spectators leaned closer. Karen buried her face in her hands. She already knew what everyone else was about to see. Then she pulled something out, a cordless drill. Interesting, very interesting. She held it for several seconds, looked around once more, and then the recording briefly froze. Only for 2 seconds, a normal buffering delay, then resumed. Karen was now standing near the lower kitchen cabinets. The drill had disappeared from her hands. Interesting, very interesting. I replayed that section, then again. The video wasn't clear enough to show exactly what happened during those missing seconds. But one thing was obvious. When the recording resumed, a cabinet door that had been perfectly aligned moments earlier was now hanging unevenly. The courtroom became silent, Dabestelt silence. Years on the bench teach you not to jump to conclusions. Possibilities are not proof. Interesting, very interesting. Then Ethan quietly spoke. Your Honor, please continue another 30 seconds. I did. Karen stepped backward, looked at the cabinet, took another photograph, then quietly placed the drill back inside the box. She picked up her purse, walked toward the exit, and before leaving the room, she looked directly into the security camera. For just a moment, that single glance stayed with me because it wasn't surprise, it wasn't confusion, it was realization. She had just remembered the camera existed. Interesting, very interesting. The courtroom remained frozen. Karen no longer looked embarrassed. She looked frightened, genuinely frightened. Then Ethan handed me one final document. A maintenance report from the security camera company. Interesting, very interesting. According to the technician, the 2-second recording interruption wasn't caused by buffering. It occurred because someone physically disconnected power to the camera. Only briefly, long enough to interrupt recording, then immediately restored it. And according to the technician's analysis, the exact moment power disappeared coincided perfectly with the moment Karen was standing beside the cabinet holding that cordless drill. The spectators gasped. But honestly, I still had one question left, a very important one, because if Karen had really tampered with the renovation, why? The answer to that question was waiting inside one final email she never expected Ethan to keep. And once I read it aloud, that smirk disappeared forever. The moment Ethan Parker handed me that final email, I knew the hearing had reached a turning point. Not because emails always reveal the truth. They don't. But years on the bench teach you that people are often most honest before they realize a dispute is coming. Once lawyers become involved, stories change. Mouths rarely do. The courtroom remained silent. Karen Whitmore no longer looked at the evidence screen. She stared at the table. Ethan remained calm. The spectators leaned forward. Everyone sensed that whatever was inside that email mattered a great deal. I opened the message. The date immediately caught my attention, October 16. 2 days before, Karen took the photographs she claimed proved the renovation had been abandoned. Interesting, very interesting. The email wasn't written by Ethan. It came from Karen herself. I read the opening paragraph, then stopped, not because I was confused, because I wanted to make absolutely certain I had read it correctly. I looked up, then back down, then read it again. The wording never changed. Interesting, very interesting. Karen had written, if this project goes over budget, I need another option. The courtroom became silent. Davelitz, silence. I continued reading. My insurance won't cover the upgrades, and I can't afford the final payment. Interesting, very interesting. The spectators exchanged curious looks because suddenly the dispute looked very different. Not a disagreement about workmanship, a financial problem. Years on the bench teach you something important. Financial pressure doesn't excuse dishonesty, but it often explains why dishonesty begins. That distinction mattered a lot. I continued reading. Karen asked Ethan whether any unused materials could be returned to reduce the remaining balance. Ethan politely replied that the custom cabinets could not be returned because they had been manufactured specifically for her kitchen. Interesting, very interesting, nothing unusual. A professional answer. Then came Karen's final response, the one she clearly hoped this courtroom would never see. I read it once, then twice, then a third time. because every word mattered. Karen wrote, "I'll figure something out." At first glance, the sentence seemed harmless, but years on the bench teach you never to evaluate one sentence in isolation. Context matters. Always, Ethan quietly handed me another document. Interesting, very interesting. A text message exchange from the following morning. Karen wrote, "If I refuse the payment, what can you actually do?" Ethan responded, "I hope we don't reach that point." Karen replied, "We'll see. Interesting. Very interesting." The confidence in those messages sounded remarkably similar to the confidence she displayed in my courtroom. Then I opened the final attachment, a voice message, short, only 23 seconds. The courtroom became completely silent. I pressed play. Karen's voice filled the room. She wasn't speaking to Ethan. She was leaving a voicemail for her sister. She laughed softly, then said something I will never forget. "I think I found a way to get out of paying for this whole kitchen." The spectators froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I replayed the recording. Karen's voice remained exactly the same, calm, confident, almost amused. Then she continued, "If everything looks unfinished, it'll be his problem instead of mine." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, shock. The bailiff immediately called for order, again and again, because suddenly every piece of evidence fit together: the photographs, the delayed payment, the cabinet adjustments, the interrupted security recording. Everything. Years on the bench teach you that intent is often the hardest thing to prove. Sometimes people prove it themselves. I looked toward Karen. She no longer had an explanation. No interruption, no objection, no smile. The smirk that had remained on her face for nearly the entire hearing was gone, completely gone. Then Ethan quietly submitted one final exhibit. Interesting, very interesting. It was an invoice from the cabinet manufacturer, not for damaged cabinets, for replacement hinges and hardware ordered after Karen reported that several cabinet doors had allegedly been installed incorrectly. I reviewed the technician's inspection notes. The conclusion immediately caught my attention. According to the manufacturer, the hinge screws showed fresh tool marks inconsistent with factory installation. Interesting, very interesting. The technician specifically noted that someone had adjusted the hinges after installation using a cordless drill, the exact type of drill Karen had been holding on the security footage. The courtroom fell silent once again. I slowly closed the file because at that moment I realized the verdict was no longer the biggest problem Karen faced. The evidence no longer suggested a simple contract dispute. It suggested something far more serious, and in just a few moments, I was about to explain exactly why. I closed the final folder and looked around the courtroom. No one was speaking, not Karen Whitmore, not Ethan Parker, not even the spectators who had whispered throughout the hearing. Years on the bench teach you that there are moments when silence carries more weight than any argument ever could. This was one of them. Karen sat motionless. The woman who had entered my courtroom with that confident smirk now couldn't bring herself to look up. Interesting, very interesting. I reviewed the evidence one final time. The signed renovation contract, the approved change orders, the payment schedule, the county permits, the inspection reports, Karen's emails, her text messages, her own photographs, the digital timestamps, the smart entry logs, the security camera footage, the manufacturer's inspection. Every independent source pointed in exactly the same direction. Not one, not two, all of them. Years on the bench teach you that when completely unrelated pieces of evidence begin confirming one another, the truth usually isn't difficult to find. The truth had been sitting in front of us all morning. Karen simply believed no one would connect the pieces. I looked directly at her. "Miss Whitmore, She slowly raised her eyes. Were you experiencing financial difficulties at the time this project was nearing completion? A long silence followed, then, yes. Interesting. Very interesting. Did you realize you could no longer comfortably pay the remaining balance? Another pause. Yes. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Those two answers mattered. Not because financial hardship is shameful. It isn't. People face difficult circumstances every day. What matters is what they choose to do next. Years on the bench have taught me that financial pressure explains many decisions. It does not excuse dishonest ones, I continued. Instead of discussing your situation honestly with Mr. Parker, you chose another path. Karen closed her eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. For the first time that day, she simply listened. I held up one of her photographs. The pictures themselves were real. The unfinished kitchen was real. The renovation delays were real. But the story attached to those photographs, that was not. Interesting, very, very interesting, because that is how deception often works. It doesn't invent everything. It takes pieces of truth and arranges them into a false conclusion. That distinction mattered enormously. Then I addressed Ethan. Mr. Parker, did you repeatedly offer to continue work once the required payment was received? Yes, Your Honor. Were those offers rejected? Every time. His answer was calm, exactly as it had been throughout the hearing. No celebration, no anger, just facts. I appreciated that. Years on the bench teach you that credibility is built long before someone ever enters a courtroom. Ethan had earned credibility through consistency. Corin had lost hers through contradiction. I leaned back slightly, then delivered my findings. The evidence overwhelmingly supports that Mr. Parker performed substantial work under the contract. The project was not abandoned. It was suspended after contractually required payments were not made. The plaintiff's own communications, photographs, electronic records, and video evidence directly contradict her testimony. The independent inspections further support the quality of the contractor's work. The courtroom remained silent. I looked toward Karen one final time. Earlier today, you smiled during nearly every witness's testimony. You seemed convinced that confidence alone would persuade this court. She lowered her head. Then I said the sentence that erased whatever remained of that confidence. Miss Whitmore, a smirk is not evidence. The room became perfectly still. I continued. It never has been. It never will be. You believe that because you appeared more confident, people would stop asking difficult questions. But courts do not decide cases based on confidence. They decide them based on facts. Interesting, very interesting. Karen quietly wiped a tear from her face, not because of my words, because she finally understood that every document she believed would help her had instead exposed her. I entered judgment in favor of Ethan Parker. The remaining contract balance was awarded, along with allowable court costs and applicable interest under the law. The evidence left no reasonable basis for Karen's claims. As people slowly gathered their belongings, Ethan walked toward the exit. He didn't smile. He didn't look back at Karen. He simply thanked the court and quietly left. That told me everything I needed to know about his character. Karen remained seated for several moments after everyone else had begun leaving. The smirk that greeted every witness that morning was gone, completely gone. Years later, I still remember that case. Not because of the amount of money involved, not because of the renovation, but because of one expression. People often assume confidence wins arguments. It doesn't. People assume arrogance intimidates the truth. It never does. In every courtroom I have ever served, I've learned one lesson that never changes. You can rehearse a story. You can rehearse your emotions. You can even rehearse your smile, but you cannot rehearse the truth. Because the truth doesn't need practice. It only needs patience. Karen smirked through nearly the entire hearing, believing she had fooled everyone in the room, but one careful question after another slowly dismantled the story she had spent months constructing, and by the time I announced my decision, the only thing left in that courtroom stronger than the evidence was the silence that followed it.